Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Sean Mills be given floor privileges through the rest of the day.
Without objection.
Mr. President, millions of Americans are hurting economically, yet so much of the debate here on the Senate floor seems to be Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other or rehashing old arguments. It seems almost as if there is a default strategy: either pound on the other party or recycle some of the stale positions that have been repeated again and again. Senator Coates and I believe that none of this really does anything to help the millions of Americans who are out of work and get the economy moving again. And the two of us have been coming to the floor of the Senate, and will continue to do so in the days ahead, to talk about what really works to get the American economy moving again. And an example would be tax reform. Tax reform like the sort of tax reform that was passed when Democrats and Ronald Reagan teamed up, and that tax reform effort helped to create 6.3 million new jobs in the 2 years after it was enacted. Now, no one can say that there's any one factor that alone creates millions of new jobs, but certainly it didn't hurt. Certainly it helped to set the economic climate. Democrats and Republicans coming together, and according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the 2 years after that kind of bipartisan effort, the country created 6.3 million new jobs, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, it's not going to be possible, of course, to pass comprehensive tax reform between now and August 2nd. But Senator Coates and I have said that as part of these budget negotiations, as part of the effort to deal with the budget in a comprehensive way and to deal with the debt ceiling issue, it ought to be possible to lock in for consideration in the fall and in the remainder of this Congress the kind of bipartisan effort that we saw a quarter of a century ago that represents an idea that really works, an idea with a proven track record of working to boost the economy, that has been bipartisan, where Democrats and Republicans, instead of spending their time pounding on each other, say, let's come together and eliminate some of these ridiculous special interest tax breaks, which are limiting our ability to grow and create family wage jobs. So Senator Coates and I are going to spend a few minutes this afternoon talking about the impact of real tax reform on jobs and economic growth. And I'd just like to start, beyond thanking my friend from Indiana, he's been a pleasure to work with, about his reaction to that kind of approach, where we focus on really what works, and especially between now and August 2nd, in these budget negotiations, Democrats and Republicans have an opportunity to look at spending and look at growth to make sure that out of those negotiations by August 2nd, there's a way to lock in for the fall and the remainder of the Congress the effort to promote bipartisan tax reform and get our economy growing again. I'd be interested in my colleagues' reaction to that.
The senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Oregon for helping arrange this colloquy. We have worked together to try to fashion a comprehensive tax reform package that we think makes a lot of sense. And just about every analyst or economist or budget expert that I have talked to and listened to or read their writings over the past several months has said, we are not going to successfully address our current debt deficit situation unless comprehensive tax reform is part of the package with which we do this. Senator Wyden and I have had the opportunity to sit down and talk about this. We obviously have been encouraging for several months that the Congress go forward and address this. We realize that such an effort cannot successfully take place before we reach the point in August or early August where we have to make a decision on raising the debt limit, and whatever package is brought before us relative to what kind of changes we can make in our financial structure to put us in a better fiscal situation. Nevertheless, knowing the importance of comprehensive tax reform to the success, to creating success for ultimately what we want to achieve, we would like to encourage all those negotiating these packages and all those members and our colleagues to look carefully at the proposal to lock, as my colleague said, to lock in to whatever package is before us a commitment, a hard commitment, an enforceable commitment to take up comprehensive tax reform, not waiting until after the next election, but take it up this fall as one of the follow-ons to the package that we ultimately will have to address, debate, and vote on coming up here in the next several weeks. I couldn't agree with my friend more that doing so now can be a very important component of our going forward in addressing the serious fiscal situation which is facing our country and which is one of our biggest challenges.
Mr. President, I thank my friend, and we're going to talk through some of the specifics of why this is important as a way to boost the economy. And in beginning, what I'd like to just lay out is that as we have seen these discussions go forward over the last couple of months about boosting the economy, invariably the fight comes down to the question of whether you ought to spend more. You ought to spend more in order, particularly in a consumer-driven economy, to create jobs and put our folks back to work. What Senator Coates and I have described is an opportunity in a way that is deficit neutral. Deficit neutral, and as my friend from Indiana knows, this has been demonstrated by our analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation. This is a deficit neutral strategy for putting our people back to work, because by eliminating some of these special interest tax breaks, and thousands of them have gotten into the tax code over the last quarter century, we can take those foolish tax breaks off the revenue rolls and use those very same dollars to create what we call red, white, and blue jobs, to put people back to work in the manufacturing sector in Indiana. And of course, the President and I know how deep the hurt is in our home state. And I wanted to begin this by way of making sure that folks really saw last month's job report as a wake-up call that would indicate that current economic policies aren't creating the jobs our citizens and our economy needs, and would specifically be willing to look at new approaches in the sense that they be genuinely bipartisan, but proven in the sense that they have a track record. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts the national unemployment rate at 9.1% in May. As the distinguished President of the Senate knows, we have parts of rural Oregon with unemployment that probably, if you were to calculate the real rate of unemployment, is over 20%. So the economic hurt is enormous. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that almost 14 million Americans who want to work but can't find jobs, almost half of them have been out of work for 27 weeks or more. Of the employed, 8.5 million have to settle for part-time jobs. And among the hardest hit are young people. The people who are trying to get in the workforce are anxious to show that they have good work habits and discipline, but cannot find work. We lost 8.5 million jobs between the worst of the fiscal crisis and the end of 2010, and only a small portion of those jobs have been created. Moreover, many of the new jobs that have been created don't pay as much as the jobs that were lost. In particular, the loss of manufacturing, jobs, and so many of our citizens, when they can get alternative employment, end up with wages far less than what they made in manufacturing. In addition, income inequality is growing because high school graduates have a jobless rate twice that of college graduates. So with millions of Americans struggling to find jobs, Senator Coates and I would like to spend just a few minutes to talk about how we can come together and talk about ways to grow the economy. I've mentioned that there's a proven track record in terms of tax reform helping. 1986, the historic tax reform between Democrats, populist Democrats like former Congressman Dick Gephardt and the late President Reagan, 6.3 million new non-farm jobs in the 2 years after that law was passed. And I believe it can happen again. The Manufacturers Alliance forecasts that Senator Coates and I, with our legislation, might have the opportunity to create nearly 2 million new jobs. The Heritage Foundation came in with the same sort of analysis. So you can never lose sight of the need to create jobs in an economy like this. And I'd like to bring my colleague into the discussion at this point, because he has done so much work, not just in Indiana, where they have, to their credit, focused on a manufacturing strategy for our country, but as part of this bipartisan effort, and get his sense of why the approach we're advocating today could be an economic boost for our country.
Well, Mr. President, I can't help but agree with my friend. It's a sad situation that we have in this country as our economy is just kind of limping along. That so many young people graduating from school just recently are unable to find a meaningful job and work. That so many middle-aged Americans trying to raise a family, save money for sending their children to school, are out of work, cannot find employment, not only at the level that they were previously used to, but even at a lower level. It is a situation that requires our enacting policies that will do everything we can to stimulate this economy and get America back to work. As I said earlier, comprehensive tax reform has been described as, just with about everyone who's looked at this situation, as an essential component of the kinds of reforms necessary to get us back to fiscal health. As Senator from Oregon said, one of the components of the tax reform plan, the Wyden-Coates plan, is that we want to maintain revenue neutrality, but at the same time we want to go after those tax exclusions and exemptions and subsidies that favor a few, but don't have broad application. They've been added over the years, particularly since 1986 when we had our last comprehensive tax reform. Over these 25 years, a number of special breaks, special subsidies, special exemptions have been added, and it totals up hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so what we're trying to do here is look at those in a comprehensive way, reduce or eliminate many of them, and then use the money saved from that to lower tax rates. Let's just look at the corporate rate. The United States, out of the 36 countries which we compete most directly with for sales around the world, the United States ranks 35th. We would be 36, except the Japanese deferred lowering their rate based on the tsunami and the after effects of that, because they had already had in place plans to lower their rate. So we literally are at the highest corporate rate of any major industrialized competitive country in the world. Senator Wyden and I, in our bill, agreed that we would take the money that was saved from eliminating a lot of those special breaks for special interests and lowering the corporate tax rate to make the United States more competitive, to bring that rate down to the mid-20s or perhaps even lower. And in doing so, it will stimulate our industries here, stimulate our exports, and put our companies in a much better position to expand and grow and compete across the world, and ultimately that translates itself into jobs. If we look at small businesses alone, the real job creators, we allow under our plan almost all small businesses to expense their equipment and inventory costs in a single year. We also incorporate a provision of reciprocity so that those companies that do have overseas sales and entities producing and selling their products, that the earnings gained there can be brought back to the United States without being taxed on a double taxation, can be brought back over a one-year reciprocity period at a very low rate, again to encourage investment, plant equipment, and employment here in America. And so at a time when consumer consumption is very weak, consumers don't have money to spend, we believe comprehensive tax reform, and particularly some of the things outlined in our plan, will help stimulate the economy, will help bring about growth, and ultimately put people back to work. And so I would kick this ball back to my colleague, Senator Wyden from Oregon, for his further thoughts on that as we continue this colloquy.
Mr. President, I'm glad that Senator Coates made that last point especially, because it's getting hardly any discussion here in the Senate, and that's the point Senator Coates made with respect to the weak consumption that we are seeing in our country, particularly, middle class folks who have the sense that there really isn't going to be economic security right now. They don't have as much money in their pockets as they would like. They've suffered, huge shocks that have caused them to pull back from some of the purchases they would otherwise make. The President of the Senate has done outstanding work with respect to trying to protect middle-class people who've lost all this equity in their homes. That usually serves as some kind of collateral for folks with a need to get a loan. That hasn't been there. We've had folks underemployed in much of the workforce. What we see is that in our economy, which has always been consumer-driven, as Senator Coates has pointed out, we're just not seeing the kind of demand from middle-class folks for goods and services. They're not going out and buying the refrigerator that they might like to have for their family. They can't get a computer for their child. They're just not able to make the purchases that are so important in a consumer-driven economy. And so what Senator Coates and I are saying is that as Democrats like Dick Gephardt and former President Ronald Reagan said a quarter century ago, they want to come together and put money into people's pockets. They want to make sure the middle-class folks who are just getting clobbered, as we have seen for months now, would be in a position to get back into the economy and start demanding some of those goods and services that are so important for long-term economic well-being. So Senator Coates and I have sought to put more money into people's pockets by repealing the alternative minimum tax. We had an excellent hearing in Chairman Baucus's committee yesterday on simplification. Get this. The middle-class person is now essentially going through bureaucratic water torture on this alternative minimum tax. They have to fill out their taxes twice on two separate systems. So what Senator Coates and I have said is let's, repeal it. That'll put some money back into the pockets of middle-class folks. And as Senator Coates has pointed out, middle-class folks won't have to spend all that money paying out accountants and all kinds of other people trying to fill out all those alternative minimum tax forms. So we'll put some money into the pockets of the middle class that way. And Senator Coates and I also advocate nearly tripling the standard deduction for all our taxpayers, which again can be a real boon for the middle class consumer that can help us spur consumer demand and with it a job creation. So I'm very glad that Senator Coates has really zeroed in on the question of the consequences of underconsumption by consumers. And I think I'd next probably like to have my friend go through some of the benefits that we'd like to provide to small business, because we all know that small business is the creation, the job engine of our economy. And Senator Coates, if you could just outline some of the benefits that on a bipartisan basis we ought to be zeroing in on with respect to small business, I think that'd be very helpful.
Well, as the senator from Oregon has said, small businesses hit particularly hard these days because many choose not to incorporate. There is a pass-through of taxation rates as if these small businesses were individuals. They're taxed at that rate. As my friend from Oregon knows, in the end of 2012, that tax rate is scheduled under current law to rise from 35% to 39.6%. Small businesses which currently are having trouble getting credit, currently having problems making ends meet, are faced with, within a relatively short period of time, a year and a half, of a tax increase. That is a deterrent to making decisions relative to expanding the business, relative to hiring new people, because they know that the taxes that they have to pay off of their earnings flow through directly to them and are going to have to be paid at the highest rate. And so, again, the Coates-Wyden bill prevents that from happening, keeps those rates at a current level. And also, as my friend from Oregon has said, simplification is a major underlying principle of the Wyden-Coates tax reform bill. It is a nightmare for individuals, as the senator from Oregon said, to try to figure out how to do this. In fact, about $6 billion is spent each year by individuals to hire professionals to fill out their tax forms because it's virtually impossible for them to figure out and work their way through this, as my friend said, the water torture, bureaucratic water torture of a process. And the thousands of hours, the hundreds and thousands and millions of hours spent filling out the your tax returns based on the complexity of the current tax code is a detriment to small businessmen who don't have the privilege of having an accountant in the back room or hiring somebody who's an expert in taxes that is like big businesses can do. They either have to go outside and hire it, or they have to spend a great deal of their own time when they ought to be on the floor selling their product or running their business, just complying with the tax code. So whether it's tax rates or whether it's simplification or whether it's incentives for small businesses who provide the bulk of the hiring in the United States, in fact, between 1995 and 2005, between 60 and 80% of all new jobs were those hired by small businesses. So we are conscious of that in this comprehensive tax reform bill which we have introduced, and we want to make sure that not only individuals, but small business people can rest with assurance that on passage of this bill, they not only will have a much simpler, easier way of reporting their taxes and complying with the tax code, but they will not be facing with a tax increase that, as I said, under current law is due to expire at the end of 2012. I want to once again kick it back to my friend to kind of wrap this up. I do agree with him that together in 1986, Ronald Reagan and congressional Democrats, Senator Bill Bradley, Congressman Dick Gephardt, Congressman Jack Kemp worked on a bipartisan basis to pass comprehensive tax reform. It did many good things and stimulated the economy and brought about a lot of new jobs. It's been 25 years since. That code has now become ever more complex, and I think we do need to go ahead and, as I said at the beginning of all this, fundamental tax reform is one of the best tools in the economic tool shed, and it's time we use it. We know it won't be easy, but we know it's been done before and it can be done again. And working together, I believe we can take on the special interests that benefit from the tax code and create a much more business-friendly tax system. I can conclude at that point. I'd like my colleague to wrap up. I thank him for his inspiration and leadership on this effort. He started this more than 2.5 years ago with Senator Gregg in a bipartisan way. Senator Gregg is retired at the end of the last Congress. I had the privilege of not only being a close friend of Senator Gregg's and an admirer of his understanding and depth of knowledge about financial issues, but inheriting all the hard work that he and Senator Wyden put together to bring this comprehensive tax bill to fruition. We've made some adjustments and debates and discussions between the two of us. We think It can be the primary vehicle for moving forward. Are we locked in stone? Are we open? No. Are we open to suggestions to make it better? Yes. But clearly, if there's an agreement between the two of us that's unbreakable, it's that this is an essential part of dealing with our current fiscal crisis. And without this, we will come up short. Just about everybody that's looked at this situation has come to this conclusion, and we're hoping that we can, in this next few weeks, get a commitment from our colleagues and all those engaged in the process of trying to put together the package that can put us back on the right fiscal track and get our fiscal situation in order, that they will incorporate into this plan, incorporate into what is brought before us, a commitment locked in to go forward with comprehensive tax reform, and we believe the Wyden Coates plan is the place to start. I thank my colleague for his efforts, and I'll turn it back to him to conclude this colloquy.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Indiana. He makes a number of important points that we want to make sure are considered as